Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now, where we bring you experts from the Badger community talking about timely and important topics. Tonight's topic is electric vehicles. They've been in the news a lot lately. Some good news and some maybe questionable news about whether we can really support the transition to EVs with the electric grid, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. And so we've got a few guests this evening who are going to help us unpack some of the important questions about EVs. What exactly are the benefits and drawbacks of driving electric for an individual or for the country as a whole? And what's the impact on US emissions if everyone were to choose an electric vehicle? Will we actually struggle to meet the demand for electricity on the grid if we made this transition en masse? And who's going to become the world leader in electric vehicle production? And will that really matter to the future of technological leadership? Our panelists tonight bring considerable industry experience as well as great academic perspectives. Rod Copes is the chairman of Exro Technologies. He's the former chief operating officer of American EV automaker Rivian, and he's an alumnus of the UW-Madison Department of Mechanical Engineering. Eric Kazyak is an assistant professor in mechanical engineering at UW-Madison with a research focus on the way we convert, store, and use energy more sustainably, including next generation beyond lithium batteries. And Greg Reichow is a partner at Eclipse Ventures, a Palo Alto-based venture capital firm focused on transforming industries. Prior to Eclipse, he was the executive leader of global manufacturing, factory automation engineering, supply chain, and product excellence at Tesla. So Greg is not actually a Badger, but he is a great partner of ours through his firm Eclipse, which does a lot of work for us on endowment investing. So Greg, we welcome you to the Badger family tonight. So thanks for joining us. This is going to be a great program, lots of great information. We're going to kick it off with Professor Eric Kazyak, who's going to share more about this technology and where it's headed and just what it means at a macro level. And then we'll get into the industry experience that Rod and Greg bring. So Eric, please take it away.
Thanks, Mike, for that introduction. Let's get the slides up. There we go. So yeah, my expertise is predominantly on what's going on inside of the batteries that are at the heart of an electric vehicle. But my goal today is to really give some context and some background on why the transition to electric vehicles from a macro level is important and why it's something that we should do. And then talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how we get there from a technology standpoint. So I'm going to start with, probably the most in the news aspect of why we should transition to electric vehicles, and that's the tailpipe emissions of fossil fuel powered vehicles, including carbon dioxide, but other things too, represent a significant environmental and social cost to society. So these externalities are not captured in the cost that we pay for a gallon of gasoline or diesel fuel at the pump, but they impact society and our pocketbooks at the end of the day. So for instance, the transportation sector is responsible for approximately 27% of the global CO2 emissions, in addition to significant amounts of ozone, NOx, and particulate matter that are emitted. But aside from emissions, there's other externalities, these things that aren't captured by the costs that we pay at the pump. That includes things like extraction of the fuels, so drilling and pumping oil, transportation of raw materials, oil spills, things like that. These result in significant damage to the environment, large amounts of area, health impacts, etc., wildlife and ecosystem impacts there as well. We also have a long and complicated supply chain that transports these fuels around the world in many cases. We have a large amount of embodied energy and carbon, not just in internal combustion engines, but also in the batteries and the vehicles that transport those batteries around. And all of these have costs associated with them. It's difficult to quantify those costs, but if you take into account the health impacts of things like particulate matter and carbon dioxide, the estimates for the United States are in the hundreds of billions of dollars a year for these other things, the things that aren't captured in the price of a gallon of gasoline at the pump. And those costs, those externalities vary by how you're getting around. So whether that's a short flight, you're driving around in a gasoline powered car, taking a bus, or driving an electric vehicle, there's impacts and costs associated with those things. So this plot at the bottom here shows how many grams of CO2 equivalent, so that's a metric for how much global warming the emissions would cause per passenger kilometer. So this is normalized by how many people it can transport and how far. But it gives you an idea kind of where the general trends are. So there's a reason to transition away from internal combustion engines and fossil fuel powered vehicles. The main alternatives that come up are battery electric vehicles. This is, of course, the topic of tonight's conversation. It's the most widely commercialized option, and it's rapidly growing. It does still have some concerns with critical materials, namely the lithium, cobalt, and nickel that are in today's lithium-ion batteries are potentially in short supply. And there's also supply chain insecurity associated with these. A large fraction of those minerals are processed in China currently. There's struggles with charging rate and the infrastructure associated with fast charging, as well as maybe cold weather performance as being a significant struggle. In comparison, fuel cell electric vehicles have a lot of similar struggles with infrastructure. Storage of hydrogen is a bigger challenge than with battery electric vehicles, and they require precious metal catalysts currently, such as platinum, which has a big cost associated with it as well. And due to the lower system level energy efficiency, using hydrogen, green hydrogen, which is made through a process called electrolysis, which could be from renewable energy, you'd need about double the renewable energy to power a fuel cell electric vehicle versus a battery electric vehicle. If we shift to biologically derived fuels, such as corn-derived ethanol or renewable diesel, there's struggles associated with what's called energy return on investment. So how much energy you have to put into the fuel versus what you get back. It's not very good currently. There's technologies that maybe could change that, but they're still pretty expensive, in addition to the potential competition between land use for food and energy applications. So all that to say, battery electric vehicles are probably the best option in the short term. So how good are they? Well, from a global warming perspective, this is a national average for annual emissions per vehicle. So average vehicle, average driving distance, all of that. And you can see here that just during the operation phase, this is excluding manufacturing, it's significantly better, all electric vehicle versus a gasoline powered vehicle, with a plug-in hybrid and a hybrid vehicle falling somewhere in between. So you're looking at something like a quarter to a fifth of the greenhouse gas emissions during the operation phase. But this varies depending on where your electricity is coming from. So this is the national average. That same electric vehicle in the state of California, where there's no coal on the grid and there's a lot more renewables, the amount of CO2 equivalent that would be emitted per year would be roughly half. That's because the electricity you're using to charge the vehicle is a lot lower carbon intensity. It also varies depending on how you're using the vehicle, how long the trips that you're going on, how long are they? How are you charging? Are you fast charging? Are you slow charging? That type of thing. Also depends on how efficiently was the vehicle designed, how aerodynamic it is, that type of thing, and how cold it is outside, that type of stuff. But I mentioned that didn't include the manufacturing phase, which according to this analysis that was done last year, the manufacturing phase of a battery electric vehicle actually contributes more global warming potential than the operation phase for most electricity blends that are low carbon, which is where we're headed, right? We don't need to only plan for what the electricity grid is now. The grid is changing dramatically and very quickly. So we need to evaluate what are these options going to be in 10 years, say. The life of a vehicle is at least 10 years, hopefully longer. The manufacturing related emissions will continue to improve as we move away from these critical materials. So we're rapidly reducing the amount of cobalt and nickel used in batteries in several different cases. We're very likely to be recycling a large fraction of those minerals at the end of life. And we're decarbonizing a lot of manufacturing processes. So this blue bar here associated with manufacturing will shrink. So the global warming potential will get even smaller. So as a result of this, in addition to the fact that lithium-ion batteries have come down in cost about 90% over the last decade plus, from over $1,000 per kilowatt hour at the pack level. So for context, a normal electric vehicle might have a 50 to 75 kilowatt hour battery pack. So 10 years ago, almost $1,000 per kilowatt hour. Now just over $100 per kilowatt hour. That's really driven this transition to battery electric vehicles, an explosion in the number of models that are available, as you can see here, as well as an explosion in the market penetration in the last couple of years. But there's still remaining challenges with electric vehicles. I'm sure that's why many of you are tuned in tonight, is to kind of get some insight into, can you trust an electric vehicle to meet the needs that you have? One of those is associated with the amount of energy that can be stored in the battery for a given weight or space. Because in a car, we only have so much space, we only have so much weight that we can work with. So if we can store more energy in the same amount of weight or space, increase the energy density, then we increase range, but we can also start using these vehicles to tow things, to haul more people or more stuff, and it enables larger vehicles, including other types of applications such as freight transportation and things like that. Fast charging is really important. I'll talk a bit more on that on the next slide, but charging rates vary widely from, if you plug into a normal 120 volt outlet at your home, you're talking a day or more to charge an electric vehicle. If you bump that up to a 240 volt outlet, you're talking a few hours, part of a day. And then a DC fast charger, the best case scenario, something like 15 minutes to add 200 or 300 miles of range. 30 minutes is more common still, but we're trending towards faster and faster charging. Cost is a pressing issue. The cost of electric vehicles is rapidly declining, and it's aided by various incentives, tax credits, and things like that. We're moving away, or we need to move away from critical and not abundant minerals such as nickel and cobalt. That needs to continue. We need to continue building out charging infrastructure, although it's probably more prevalent than you might expect. There's many thousands of chargers, public chargers scattered around the country now, mostly focused on high traffic corridors. So there's a good chance that the drives that you do regularly are already covered. You might have seen reports in the news about low temperature performance, how electric vehicles weren't starting due to the cold and that type of thing. Well, that might be true, but what those reports often leave out is the fact that all vehicles can struggle at very low temperatures, including gasoline-powered cars, which also use a battery to start, right? It uses a lead acid battery instead of a lithium-ion battery, but the same physics are at play that are limiting your operation. Similarly, safety has been probably blown out of proportion in many ways. Battery electric vehicles can and do catch on fire, but at actually a much lower rate than internal combustion engine vehicles by all accounts that I've seen that are, statistically based. So one of the challenges that are facing EVs is really this: how do we get out the word about electric vehicles and what they can do and not do, and maybe shift public opinion a little bit. So I mentioned I was going to talk about fast charging. To drive that point home a little bit better, I moved to Madison, where I am now, from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which is not quite a 400-mile drive. And if I wanted to do that drive in an electric vehicle, say one of these two. So the top one, 170 miles of range, but maybe I'd only be comfortable driving at 130 miles. I don't want to run out of charge. But it charges from 0 to 100%, let's say, in 12 minutes. The second car here has double the range, more than double the useful range, but it takes an hour to charge. So let's consider, under these assumptions up here, if we're cruising at 70 miles per hour, it takes 5 minutes to get off and then get back on the highway to get plugged in. And we assume that there's plenty of DC fast charging along this route. Car one takes a little over 6 hours. And car two, because the charging takes so much longer, you actually get there later, despite the range being less. So by enabling fast charging, we can actually overcome issues with range and enable use of maybe smaller batteries in many applications. And remember, if it's half the battery, you're using half the lithium, half the nickel, half the cobalt. The battery probably weighs about half as much and costs about half as much. So this has a lot of different advantages. So when we go to create this DC fast charging network that I'm talking about relying on here to alleviate range anxiety, it's actually already happening. So the 150 plus kilowatt range of fast chargers, so the highest tier of fast charging, is growing at more than 50% per year worldwide, and actually much higher than that in the United States currently. There's prevalent incentives and subsidies from the federal government that will continue growth, and that are also focused on improving reliability and availability of those chargers, as well as making them communicate with each other so that there's a better data system to identify locations that are best suited for new installations. So this will need to continue. It will need to continue to be built out over the next 20 years or so as the battery electric vehicles become a larger fraction of the fleet. But remember that fast charging only represents a small fraction of the overall infrastructure. Really, most of the chargers will either be at homes, single family or multifamily residents, and destination charging, so at restaurants, office spaces, retail spaces, that type of thing, where they don't need to be as fast. And that's important because if we look at the cost of a fast charger, the very fastest chargers might cost a few $100,000 between the module and the installation, whereas a level 2 slower charger is more like $10,000. So about an order of magnitude or 10 times more expensive for these fastest chargers. So we need to be smart about where and when we're building those. And then my last slide here is to kind of convey that battery electric vehicles will continue to get a lot better over the next decade plus. And one of the reasons is kind of shown graphically here. So current lithium-ion batteries are better than this paper from couple years ago said that lithium ions could be. So we're at 260 watt hours per kilogram, so off the edge of this axis, and about 500 watt hours per liter currently. But the batteries that are coming down the pipe that are under development are more out here. So this is a lithium metal-based battery, but it's safe. And the way that we do that is by replacing the flammable liquid electrolyte with a solid state material that's non-flammable. That enables us to use lithium metal in a safe manner and roughly double the energy density of the battery. And that'll have wide-ranging implications. You'll certainly be able to have vehicles that go further, but also charge faster, have a longer life, and better safety. These are still being scaled up. It remains to be seen how much they'll cost, that type of thing. But in the next 3 to 5 years or so, expect to start seeing vehicles with solid-state batteries. That's what I got.
Well, that's great, Eric. And I'm sure we're going to have a lot of questions based on that, just about the charging network and the trade-offs that you see between range and fast charging models, et cetera. So we'll come back to you with questions shortly, but next I want to turn to our alum, Rod Copes. He's had experience across the auto industry with both combustion and electric vehicles. So Rod, we're really excited to hear your thoughts about what I think you believe is the biggest transformation the auto industry has ever seen. That's not hard to, I guess, believe that, and just want to hear a little bit of your perspectives over the long term and what you've learned. So Rod, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks for having me, Mike. Yes, we are living in an exciting time. And as Mike said, I believe we are in currently the largest transformation of the auto industry since its inception over 100 years ago, probably over 120 years ago, right? And it's all because of electrification. And when that happens, just as the auto industry when it started, it creates huge opportunities for innovation and creativity and commerce. And so what's happening now is hundreds of startup companies, whether building new EVs or focused on a technology or software or commerce somewhere associated with electric vehicles, are starting. And it's really an exciting time, especially for new engineers coming out of UW Madison. What it's going to allow is, a lot of people to really reinvent and think, what is the auto industry? So there'll be a lot of winners, there'll be a lot of losers, and in the end, there'll be a lot of consolidation as well, as the marketplace decides who's going to win and who's going to lose. And so, as Professor Kazyak said, there's a lot of reasons for this. I believe one of the reasons is we've kind of hit diminishing returns with the internal combustion engine. After 120 years, we can only squeak so much out of that. as well as our society. And most of us want a better planet to live in, and one that's going to be around for our kids. And so, and a lot of that is really creating this catalyst for change. But at the same time, I've been in the industry for a few years. I believe an electric vehicle is actually a better solution to the problem. It's a simpler mechanical and electrical device. Its performance is actually much, much better. It handles better. It's more fun. And the total cost of ownership is actually lower. While it has initial upfront costs, I am converted to EVs. So I have two EVs. I have a Tesla Model Y, which has 85,000 miles on it. I've owned it for 4 years. And I have a Rivian R1S, which I've owned for a year and has 12,000 miles on it. And I can honestly say I have refilled the wiper fluid twice. And I've bought a couple of sets of tires as well. But I have not had any of the maintenance and the wearable items and consumable items that most internal combustion engine vehicles have. Now, granted, I also charge in my garage, which is a convenience, and so I don't have to go to the gas station as well. But with that, as the professor also said, battery technology advancements are coming very quickly. Again, 120 years of internal combustion engine work. We're just scratching the surface of, especially of lithium-ion batteries. And so I think we're going to see dramatic change just in a few years. So the cost of a battery in an electric vehicle is a third of the cost of the car. And so what we've seen over a decade is about a 7% annualized reduction in the cost of the battery. So it's getting less expensive. The range has gone up threefold in the last 10 years. The charging time has gone down dramatically with DC fast charging. We may have some issues in cold weather, but we adapt and we figure it out, just like we did, back in the day. I remember being, a young pup in a Wisconsin winter, and the cars never started. We actually had to go into the carburetor and try to, get them to start when it was below zero. And another beautiful part about electric vehicles is the second use of the battery packs. There's a lot of great work being done on, after 10 years or so, when the vehicle may not be able to sustain a charge at 80 or 90%, those battery packs can actually be used for energy storage and put into the grid for renewable energy, and can actually have another decade or two of life. So a lot of really exciting work that's happening. Now, there are some bigger problems that our professor, rightly stated, but I think those are going to take care of themselves. The first one is charging infrastructure. It will take years. I mean, we didn't have gas stations pop up on our every corner. It took decades, literally, and it's still going to take decades to get that infrastructure and to get the technology where it's as convenient as an internal combustion engine. But we're making rapid improvements. I think one of the fundamental challenges we have is not in our society in the United States right now, is the cost of a brand new vehicle. So last year, the average cost of a new internal combustion engine vehicle was almost $50,000. And the cost of an electric vehicle was even more, $60,000. And what we've had happen is the big OEMs and the car companies, they focus on high margins, higher cost vehicles because it's a very capital intensive business, and that's where they make higher margins, right? So they have actually vacated the lower end of the market. So try finding a brand new vehicle for under $20,000. My search found two last year out of over 100, actually over 250 new car models sold in the United States. Two have a list price under $20,000 because the auto industry has vacated that space. They can't make money at it, and they don't want to. So what does that leave? For over a half, if not 2/3 of people who want to buy a vehicle in the United States, they can't afford a new vehicle. they can't afford an $800 or $900 a month payment. So what's left for them? A used vehicle. And last year, the average used vehicle was $27,000 a year. And on a payment, that's $400 to $500 a month. So even a used vehicle is too expensive for a lot of people. So, we've got to work on the affordability. And I really think the beauty of electric vehicles is that they can actually be a lot less expensive than an internal combustion engine over time. We know that's not the case now, but as the battery technology really continues to advance and we get to potentially a solid state, lower cost, affordable battery, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunities for the average consumer in the United States. But bottom line is, car companies have to make a desirable vehicle. They have to make affordable vehicles. And we know electric vehicles are not going to be for everyone. I hear that from families and friends, family and friends already. It's like, well, I don't want an EV, and that's okay. It's going to take a couple of decades for this transformation to happen. And there's always going to be a use case or a lifestyle that says, hey, internal combustion engine works better in this case. But the bottom line is it's coming. It went from 2% a few years ago to almost 8% last year of new light passenger vehicles were electric. And we see that trend continuing with all of the support from obviously government, from academia, as well as from consumers and from commerce. So in summary, we're in a very exciting time. It's a great time to be in the industry. I believe electric vehicles will continue to grow in sales. I do think the costs, especially of the battery, will go down. And at some point within the next 3 years, we're going to see equilibrium for an internal combustion engine and a like EV, which is going to make it a lot more advantageous of buying an electric vehicle. And the vehicles themselves are going to get better. I mean, Tesla demonstrated it 15, 20 years ago. They showed that an electric vehicle didn't have to be a golf cart. And quite honestly, that's what's really been a catalyst for this change. Because if we remember, General Motors actually was producing an electric vehicle in the late 1990s called EV1, but they couldn't make money at it. And, the battery was really complex and expensive. So they actually shut it down. And Tesla took it from there and actually proved to everyone they can reimagine what a vehicle is, and more importantly, what an electric vehicle is. And a lot of us are now involved in this industry because the sky's the limit. So anyway, not all of these new startups, and quite honestly, I don't think all of the current OEMs, large car companies, are going to make it through this huge transformation in the industry. And it'll be interesting to see, to watch and see what happens. But ultimately, the customer is going to determine who's successful. And again, bottom line is an affordable vehicle, but also a desirable vehicle is going to really determine who the winners are. So anyway, thank you very much. Look forward to some Q&A a little bit later.
Great observations, Rod. I'm certainly going to want to come back to you and understand what the externalities are in the market for cars that keeps us from filling this demand for a low-cost vehicle, because obviously in the restaurant industry, we got fast food. It's pretty cheap. People can get what they want. And I agree with you. I don't think that's working in the auto industry, but I don't quite know why. So I'll look forward to talking more about that. But next, we are going to be joined by Greg Reichow. Greg, as noted, is a partner at Eclipse Ventures, which is a great partner of ours in investing our endowment funds. And he is really an expert in manufacturing and supply chain in complex systems and has a lot of experience in electric vehicles. And so we look forward to your comments as well, Greg.
All right, Mike, thanks for having me here today. And by the way, we're very proud to have UW as a partner. This has been something I've cared a lot about for many years. I started my career working in renewable energy generation, a company called SunPower, actually led by a UW alum, Tom Werner, and then moved into how to go harness that renewable energy that we were creating into transportation through Tesla. And, maybe given that, I think maybe I'll start with a provocative statement that might surprise you. And it is that EVs, I think, in many ways have failed in the past, and many more are likely to fail in the future. And Rod touched on a bit of this, but thought I'd share with you maybe 2 stories from my time at Tesla that kind of really get to the point of what I'm driving at here. So the first was back in 2012 when we were launching the Model S. We were about 3 months away from starting production, and we had a big media event, invited all the media out to the factory. We were going to unveil the car. Elon was about ready to get up on stage and do a demo. And just before he walked up on stage, he came over to where I was standing next to the CTO and the head of engineering. And he kind of said in this really excited way, hey guys, I've been thinking about this, and I'm pretty sure that we can make the car a lot faster. And, we're a bit shocked. The car was already spec'd. This is the Model S, was spec'd to be 0 to 60 in about 5.4 seconds, which at the time was a very fast, would make it a very fast premium sports sedan. And he said, yeah, Elon, there are ways to make it faster, but, the car is designed, we can think about that as kind of a step down the road for the vehicle. And, no longer did we finish that conversation. He got up on stage and, unveiled the car. And as he was unveiling the car, made the grand pronouncement that not only would the car be shipping in 3 months, but that the car would be shipping with a performance package that would have a 0 to 60 time in 3.1 seconds. So you can imagine our reaction. We oftentimes would joke that we'd hear about product features and specs at Tesla by either watching Twitter or listening to the media. And, it led to, quite frankly, a huge amount of chaos in the company to go figure out how in a short couple months we could go rethink the entire drivetrain, the electronics, and parts of the battery to make that possible. I'll come back to why that was really important. And maybe a second example was about that same time, we were really struggling with the door handles on the car. And I'm not sure how many of you recall the Model S, but it had self-presenting door handles that would normally be flush to the car, and then they would present out when you walked up to the car. And they were also made of cast magnesium, a very expensive part. We oftentimes would joke that there were more moving parts in the door handles of the Tesla Model S than there were in the electric motor. And that actually is not a joke, it's true. And as a result of all that complexity, they were very expensive. They were a reliability nightmare for us. We were very concerned. So, as a bunch of smart executives at the company, we thought, well, let's all get together and have a meeting with Elon and walk through why these door handles are just a really bad idea. And, some brave soul offered up to be the person that did that. And the meeting lasted for about 5 minutes. And he very quickly stopped us and said, you don't understand. This is the first part of the car that a customer will interact with. That experience that they have will define how they feel about not only the car, but about our company. And it will define what this company means. So when I say that many car companies have failed in the past with EVs, it's because they looked at the problem of how do I build an EV? And they would take an existing car and stuff a battery in there and put a motor in there and call it an EV. But what they missed was that you really need to bring a better product to market for a technology transition. And that's one of the things that I think, Tesla did right at the very beginning, was realizing that the mission was not to go build an EV. The mission was to go build a car that was better in every other way that happened to be an EV. And that would be the way that we catalyze the industry to really get serious about EVs back when they were mostly joked about. So I think a very important point also is to think about going forward for companies. Companies that realize that, I think, will be successful. Some of the larger car companies have been slow to realize that. But I would say the very positive news is that that's changing quite a bit. And I'm seeing a lot of new, exciting developments at more of the traditional automakers that are building some pretty compelling products. So that's point one. Second point is, and Eric touched on this, is related to safety. While EVs they can be a lot of fun, they are a great customer experience. Like nothing beats getting in the car and feeling that acceleration for the first time. And they're really important for the future of reducing our carbon impact. But what really is not very well understood is just how much safer they are. And, Eric touched on the issue of fires. And I remember the first time that we had a Model S catch fire, it was driving down a freeway And it was kind of a freak thing where there was a tow hitch on the road, and it hit the bottom of the car and impaled the battery pack and resulted in a fire. And it made news all over the world, both on TV and newspaper, and all the talk was about how dangerous electric cars are and the potential for fire. The part that was a bit shocking is that the average number of car fires in a day, just in the US, is not one, but it's 33 per hour. So the one event with Tesla made headline news. You had 33 cars per hour were exploding in flames across the country of gasoline-powered cars, and you probably didn't hear about that one bit. And a lot of that is just related to when things are new, people don't have a good way of judging risk in many ways. And there's some pretty neat features about EVs that actually make them dramatically safer. The first is that EVs have usually a very heavy battery pack that's mounted low in the car. And that creates a very low center of mass for the vehicle, which translates into it's really hard to tip it over when you get into a crash or for it to roll over. And as a matter of fact, in some of the crash testing that we did in the early days, the machines that were used to go induce a rollover were unable to get the cars to roll over because of that low center of mass. And when a car rolls over, it's a time when people can often be injured. So that's one. A second thing is when you think about a conventional vehicle, you have this problem of a gigantic mass of metal in front of you, the engine. And a lot of the design of conventional vehicles is how do you make sure that in a frontal collision, that big old engine doesn't end up in your lap or crushing your legs. And the beauty of an EV is that you typically don't have a lot of components up in the front of the car, and it allows for a much larger crash structure, which can absorb much more of the energy in a collision, and therefore just making it much safer overall. So EVs are fun. They're a lot safer, done right. Maybe the last thing then that I think Rod did a nice job kind of touching on is the cost. So when I think about what are some of the barriers to adoption right now, EVs are just too expensive today in many ways. And there's, I think, a lot of hope here, though. So back in the 1930s, there was an engineer, Curtiss Wright Aircraft, that made a really interesting observation, and it became known as Wright's Law. And that observation was that for every doubling of cumulative production, the cost of aircraft dropped by about 20%. And this actually became a core part of how the Department of Defense was procuring aircraft back in the day. This was, I think before the cost plus models were understood. That took us in the opposite direction the last 30 or 40 years. But, that idea of experience curves and learning rate is amazingly consistent across industries. The auto industry, it's ranged, around 15% or so. Probably the best example of this has been in the electronics industry, specifically with semiconductors. That learning rate or experience rate is about a 30% reduction in cost for every doubling of production. And that's why you might hear these stories or these anecdotes of, if you tried to build an iPhone today with the pricing of transistors back in the late 70s, your iPhone would cost you over $1 billion and certainly not fit in your pocket. And I think the good news, the bad news and the good news is the conventional automotive industry, as Rod pointed out, has been pretty stable in terms of its growth of annual vehicles. We're building about 80 to 90 million new vehicles a year, and it's very mature. And there's really not a lot of cost coming out of the conventional side of automotive, and that's why we don't see the prices really changing very much. At least certainly not going down. And the good news is when you look at an EV, more than half the cost of an EV is in the battery and the electronics that are in that vehicle. And that part of the supply chain today is just at the very beginning of its scaling. A couple of years ago, we were about a 2% adoption of EVs. It's a bit higher now. But if you think, forecasts over the next 7 or so years are for that market to grow by about a factor of 8x, that's another 3 doublings of that supply chain and that infrastructure to go build these core critical electronics. And I think that coupled with that experience curve of how costs come down as we scale that part of the industry really creates a great opportunity for us to see a lot of costs come out of the really expensive parts of EVs and truly make these cars more affordable so they can be achieving mass market adoption. And I think finally, the really cool thing there is I wound up working overseas for a long time, bringing manufacturing overseas. One of the reasons I was really excited to come back to Tesla, or to join Tesla, was to bring manufacturing back to the US. I think way too often in history, we have examples of, we develop a new technology here domestically, whether it be televisions or transistors or semiconductors, lithium-ion batteries. These were all developed here or invented here in the US. And then ultimately, we let the manufacturing slip away. And with that, a lot of the long-term value that comes from those programs. And I think with this technology transition that we have happening right now with EVs, it's a real opportunity for the country to invest in this, become a leader worldwide in this industry, and reap the benefits of that and the prosperity from it. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Perfect set of comments to kind of pair with what we heard earlier from Eric and Rod. So very complimentary. And I'm going to start with a question from Rachel Pershke, who might have actually given a shout out to Rod. I don't know. Do you guys know each other, Rod? Is that?
Yeah. We worked together at Harley Davidson a long time ago.
Okay. Well, she's wondering, if you look over an 8 to 10 year horizon, just at current prices today, what would be the annual cost of owning an EV versus a combustion vehicle? And let's say kind of the median vehicle of each type. So maybe it's a, $10,000 disadvantage to buy the EV, but then owning it over 10 years, what's the net of that? Any ideas?
Well, I don't know if anybody has data, but I'm leading another effort. We're starting up an EV company that's, again, at the lower end of the price scale. And our data suggests that, when we launch it in 2026 or so, understanding where batteries are going to be, that we believe our total cost of ownership over a 4 to 5 year time period can be up to 30 to 50% less than, like, say, a Ford Bronco for $40,000. So that's just one data point, but there's I'm sure my colleagues here probably have better data than I.
Yeah, I can add on that. I mean, the data, Eric, maybe you've got some actual data. Mine's maybe a bit dated, but back when I was at Tesla, the numbers that we looked at in terms of cost of ownership, these were on more premium sedans at the time. It was around a 3-year time period to start to break even and then be on the positive side.
Yeah, I can weigh in here as well. I'd say it depends on a lot of factors, right? How much does electricity cost where you live, and that sort of thing will affect the cost of ownership for an electric vehicle. Same on the gas side, right? How much does gas cost? I'm guessing, based on what I see in the comments, there's been some about like that longer 8 to 10 years, what happens to the battery, right? What's the cost of maintenance? And I think this stems from the first generations of electric vehicles had a relatively limited battery life, I would say, compared to what the electric vehicles that are coming out now should have. So that 8 to 10 years, the industry standard is 8 years, 100,000 mile warranty on the battery. But the battery technology has come a long way since the battery EVs from 10 years ago. So I would expect in many cases now, the lithium-ion batteries that are in electric vehicles today to outlast the vehicle part of the electric vehicle. At least that is very much within reach for lithium-ion batteries, where 300 to 500,000 miles of driving, which is longer than the vast majority of people will use the vehicle. So that lends itself to continuing advantage of the electric vehicle compared to the internal combustion engine. The longer we can make the batteries last. And that has other advantages too. So there's this ecosystem, right? There's going to be infrastructure for charging. There's going to be a need for more storage on the electricity grid as we try to push to more renewables. And I think there's a synergy between electric vehicles, which have a large amount of storage capacity, but also controllable storage capacity when we charge. Like if I get home at work and I plug in my car, I don't necessarily care if it's charged in an hour or 8 hours. I just need it to be charged when I go to work the next day. So there's freedom there if we can leverage that synergy there can be value added actually to the electric vehicle owner because you're providing flexibility to the electricity grid while benefiting renewable energy on the grid as well.
Great perspectives on that. Rod, you'd mentioned earlier, why are there no inexpensive new cars? And, I also often wonder about why are we so fixated on cars that have, it's sort of like pontoon boats, 99% of them are parked at the dock the entire time they exist. Cars, like 80% of the capacity in a car goes unused constantly while it's being driven around. Way too heavy. I mean, what would it take for us to get to a different point in, how we think about vehicles and how we can produce more, much cheaper vehicles that don't have so much capacity, but they're still safe?
Well, if I may, one example that everybody knows is wildly popular, and when it came out 3 or 4 years ago, the MSRP of the Ford Maverick, the small pickup truck, was actually under $20,000. Well, now it's actually under $24,000. So it's gone up, what is that, 20%? But you can't find one. If you go and look for one, you will find 90% of what they sell are closer to $35,000. So they advertise the base vehicle, but they have packages. And if you want the hybrid one, which everybody wants, it's now over $30,000. So it is the trick of the OEMs that they've always done to get margin and to make money. And when they make money, they make a lot of money. And it's going to take, just like Greg was there at Tesla, you got to think differently. And you've got to figure out a way to be profitable with a sub $20,000 vehicle. And that will change the world because it takes a different mindset. And that's what he experienced. And that's what Elon Musk was brilliant at.
Good answer. Mark Schmidt wonders who pays the cost to build charging stations at retail or restaurant locations, and how much does it cost to charge at these locations? And I don't know if that's the actual cost or the price the consumer would pay. We're going to see these things popping up at fast food restaurants that want to get out ahead, or will they be at traditional, is Quick Trip going to have charging stations? Where do you see that, Mark? I don't know who wants that question.
I can start with a bit of that for some historical context. So, when we first started rolling out the superchargers, it was very interesting. So when we'd show up to places, and you can imagine we tried to locate them by restaurants and shopping malls and that type of thing. They were a bit skeptical, and we had to pay for the land. We had to, put in the chargers, the superchargers that obviously Tesla paid for. And then we had to pay for all the electricity, the utility connection. They're getting into specific numbers. It was a hefty tab for every supercharge station that was installed. But then an interesting thing happened. A lot of these restaurants and shopping malls noticed that you all of a sudden now have a captive audience that had about a half hour to an hour of time to walk around and buy things, and or eat at their restaurant. And it actually started to change pretty dramatically to where it moved from, okay, we'll give you the land for free and you pay for everything, to, much later on, kind of more towards the time that I wound up leaving Tesla, we had places where they would offer to pay for the electricity, and we would just put in the charging station on their land. So it's interesting how that's changed over time.
We've had many suggestions from employees at the foundation that we provide free charging stations. We haven't been able to do that quite yet. and I should add, we don't have free gas either. So,
I think one of the things that Eric touched on that I think is really key is people that don't own EVs, I think, often wonder, what is it going to look like to drive, and where are all the, charging stations, the equivalent of the gas station. And I think once you've owned an EV for a while, you really understand that is actually a very rare thing that you wind up using it in most cases. And that what most consumers wind up using is it's just this even more convenient thing of not having to stop, at a gas station with your gas car, or a stop at a public charger, and that you just pull into your driveway at night and you plug in your car and you wake up the next morning with a full tank. Of course, that doesn't work for all situations. Road trips are an obvious example where you do need to have charging infrastructure. But I would say, at least my experience of owning now EVs for over 12 years now is I probably can count less than 15 times that I've used a public charger in that time period.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I would add one thing. I think we're approaching a tipping point when it comes to charging infrastructure, in that we've reached a point where there's a critical mass of electric vehicles on the road. And so the utilization of existing chargers is starting to increase. So one report that I saw said that the break-even point for an electric vehicle charger, and I'm sure this varies by power and how much you paid to connect to the transmission and all of that, but the break-even point was something around 18% utilization. So 18% of the time there was somebody charging at the station. And if you reach 30%, then you need to build another one next to it, because there's psychology such that if the chargers are full 30% of the time, it seems like you're going to have anxiety about finding an open one. So there's that window between 18 and 30% that's where you need to operate. And in the last year or two, a lot of chargers have gone from below 18% to above 18%. So that means that you're now making money. It's a profitable venture. So where does the money come from? Well, it comes from people that want to invest and make money off of it. Now, there are incentives and subsidies, and I think that'll be key to connecting the dots, right? There's going to be a lot of locations where we need chargers that won't be profitable. And that's where subsidies and incentives and things, I think, will be really important to make them a more equitable system, right? So that rural people and places off the beaten path are still accessible to people with electric vehicles. So that'll be a piece of the puzzle as well. But I think at your Culver's, for instance, is going to be somebody that wants to make money.
Are there ever fights at these public charging stations? I know friends in Madison who said they were on a trip and they went through Iowa and they got to a place that had charging stations, but there were these big combustion engine trucks parked in front of them and they couldn't access it or something. Is that a problem at all? I mean, is any lore about that, Greg, or is this all?
I mean, I've seen the the fun news stories about that as well. I've never personally experienced it. I do think, though, with the number of vehicles really dramatically increasing over the last probably 5 years, it's gone from you'd pull into a charging station, and if you're on a road trip, for example, and you just pull up and start charging, to in some cases having to wait a bit. But I think this is a place too where car companies can be pretty smart about providing better intelligence in the car. And, in a lot of vehicles today, you can actually see at the charging location they may be going to, how many chargers are available and even what their charge rate is at that moment in time. So you can make better decisions about where charge stations are that are less congested.
Yeah. And if I might add, again, complimenting Greg, I know he's not Elon, but Tesla, their charging network is incredible. And that was a big part of their success. And I would say every other charging network is subpar. But now that Tesla is going to monetize that and let every manufacturer on, essentially, it really, really helps the average EV customer. Again, I've had the Model Y Tesla for 4 years. I've had the Rivian for about 1 year. When we would go on the longer trip, we would take the Tesla because it's just easy and it works. But we're now able to take the Rivian, which in my mind actually rides better on the highway because of the infrastructure coming up, even though we haven't been able to use the Tesla yet, the Tesla charging network. That's coming within the next month or two. So a lot of dramatic changes and improvements, which will help everybody who buys an EV.
Great. Thank you. Greg, I think you mentioned working at SunPower with Tom Warner back in the day. He has chimed in question. EV seems out of sight, out of mind, in that it still requires production of electricity, which often requires fossil fuel. So if we think through kind of the ground up comparison of gas versus electric vehicle cost per mile, that 10-year analysis we talked about earlier, does that take account of all the externalities of the electricity production as well?
Yeah, no, and I think maybe Eric has some better data on this. The thing I can share about that, it's a very good point. One of the things we looked at, and this was kind of more from I can answer it a bit more from a carbon perspective, not directly answering the question on cost per mile, but even on, grids. And I remember back in the day when we looked at some of the dirtier grids in the US, it was still from a carbon perspective, better off to be driving an electric car. And a lot of that came down to the inherent efficiency that you get through an electric vehicle versus a gasoline powered car, and kind of same energy. An EV is dramatically more efficient. And of course, then as the grid is transitioning, and, the grid's transitioned quite a bit over the last, many years, in many ways, solar's played a really big role in that it just gets better over time. So I think both things need to happen. Like we can't solve the problem overall, whether it be for carbon or cost in a silo. We need to have lower cost and cleaner sources of generation. And at the same time, we got to be able to, have solutions like EVs that allow us to consume that energy in a way that works with those energy sources. Eric, anything you would add?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The efficiency of electric vehicles is really kind of staggering. So internal combustion engine, roughly 30% efficient on the best case scenario. A battery electric vehicle can be upwards of 90% efficient on an energy standpoint. So the energy that you put in from the grid actually going to moving the car, right? So because of that, even if you're using a grid mix today, you come out ahead. If you were on pure coal, you wouldn't come out ahead. But coal is decreasing dramatically in this country and very quickly. Over 80% of the capacity added last year was wind, solar, and battery storage in the US on the grid. So the grid balance is evolving dramatically, and that will continue to make electric vehicles make more and more sense from that standpoint. Now, that requires storage, right? Wind and solar are intermittent inherently. So that requires storage. It requires flexibility on the grid. I think there's a lot of opportunity to have a synergistic ecosystem where you enable flexibility on the grid and adding value to an electric vehicle moving forward.
And one of the cool things about EVs, I think too, that's not yet been really explored is, there's this phenomenon happening as we're bringing on more, solar in the US. There's this kind of growing, or just renewables in general, there's this growing what's called the duck curve problem of during the peak of production during the day, demand drops, for conventional sources of energy, and then it spikes up a lot at night, or kind of early evening, and then in the morning. And this is a problem for, the utilities, because they have to have installed capacity that meet that peak power requirement. And one of the neat things about EVs is that you can now start to, with smart charging and figuring out, how do you offset charging to the right time and push it during times when there is more capacity. There's a unique opportunity that we've not had before as the percentage of those vehicles grow to actually act as a bit of a dampener on that growing duck curve problem.
Great. Well, listen, we are at the top of the hour, and we try to respect everybody's time here. I know we asked you to stay for an hour on the show, and what an informative program. There were many other great questions. I would have loved to learn more about the life cycle of lithium-ion batteries. Where do they come from? How are we going to get rid of them? But maybe we'll ping one or two of you in our follow-up email to our listeners. We can let them know a bit about some of these questions. But really informative program. Greg, thanks for being a great Badger partner. We forgive you your engineering degree from Minnesota. I have a new respect for Gopher Engineering. So, and Eric and Rod, thank you so much. This has been a great program.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye.
And thanks to our audience again. Thanks for joining us tonight. Really a lot of great questions. And as I said, we'll try to send a few of those out to our panelists and get their thoughts and share them back with you in our follow-up from this week's show. So I hope you'll join us again next month. We'll have another program on Tuesday, April 16th. But until then, thanks for being here this evening and participating in On Wisconsin.
In 1848, just 2 months after the creation of our beloved state, a great university was born, the University of Wisconsin, to serve, educate, and benefit people from every corner of Wisconsin and beyond. And for 175 years, we have pushed forward, energizing dreams and igniting innovation. With educational opportunities that create promise and research that improves lives, UW-Madison is a place where an idea can change the world. And as we look forward, we also look back to stand up for what's right, build common bonds, and a better future. When combined with inspired goofiness and Badger spirit, there's an inspirational and unconventional vibe that's all Madison. It's more than just fun and games, though. At the UW, we go from brainstorms to breakthroughs, from today's students to tomorrow's leaders. This is where an idea can change the world, the whole world, a corner of the world. My world, our world. UW-Madison's profound eurekas and personal ahas transform us all and serve the greater good. As proud Badgers, we celebrate the last 175 years and the next as the UW charges forward. On Wisconsin.